Hello and welcome back to my build and shootout series. Today we're going to be continuing along with the CRF300L build. I recently switched over from a WR250R for some reasons we'll cover in some later videos. I'm going to get everybody up to speed quickly. At the end of this video I'm going to link back to a couple of the previous shootouts that I did with a WR250R against a CRF300L. It took place in the woods on kind of a more rooty and clay bottom. Now I'm going to the absolute worst case scenario for a dual sport, where I'm going to compare the CRF300L in stock form, and then I'm going to be running it against the same bike with a Ktech suspension, both with the 20 IDS front cartridge inserts and the Razor R Lite shock in the rear. For the shootout, I've also left my 50/50 tires on. I'm running a Motaz Tractonator GPS in the front and the IRC, whatever it is, that came stock with the bike in the rear. It was terrible. Would not recommend it all in the sand. It's manageable everywhere else, but man, it is not a sand tire by a country mile. At this point, I'm going to throw in a caveat because it's going to come across as really negative in this video towards the 300L as a stock bike. I love the bike as a stock bike. There's a reason that I did the wood shootout first, as I knew it would be much better there, and in all honesty, with the exception of deep sand and whoops, it's not as big of a crisis. This makes everything that is bad about the stock suspension worse and dangerous, and we're going to cover that. But I do want to make sure that everybody hears me loud and clear off the start that this is the only scenario where I would say that this is true, but it is one that allows us to talk a little bit about suspension basics and maybe get a little better understanding of why it's important and whether you need it or not. Now, I'm not a suspension specialist. I need to point that out on the get-go, so you get what you pay for. But I'm going to do my best to try to explain this as thoroughly as possible. I'd also like to throw in a little mention that this is incredibly simplified. I'd be more than willing to have a more complex discussion, but this is meant to keep it as simple as possible for people that haven't done suspension basics or aren't mechanical by trade. Now, I've had to make a small adjustment to the video because I crashed on the flying lap on the stock suspension. I didn't care to go back out for a second go at this. I felt I was really pressing my luck pushing this hard. The bike was all over the place with the 50/50 tires and bottoming out just constantly. But I do want to point out that I don't consider the 300L dangerous in most scenarios, only riding fast in deep whoops in the deep sand. Everywhere else, honestly, it's not that dangerous, guys. You just need to learn how to ride it a little bit more carefully. But in this scenario, would not recommend. So in 4 minutes or less, and I apologize for how much I've had to simplify this. The 300 suspension, the root of the cause of the problem is that Honda's decided to put a really lightweight spring for what I can only assume is about half of a human being that they anticipated riding this bike. It makes it quite plush, but as we're going to discuss, it also creates some real conflict, which sand does a really good job of bringing out. Now there's a few things at play, but I'm going to pick on the spring rate that they've chosen as the primary cause of my problems here, because it's kind of connected to them all. Now, the purpose of a spring in motorcycle suspension is to set the ride height. It does play a small part in preventing you from bottoming out, but realistically, it's to bring your bike back to the neutral position. The damping of the bike is what controls your suspension going up and down. It's effectively brakes acting as either storing energy slower into the spring or faster. Now, when you're designing suspension, you first set the ride height for the rider based on using the proper weights, and then you adjust damping so that it can control the amount of energy that each one of those springs can hold. Now, obviously, a stiffer spring can hold more energy than a softer spring, which is why damping needs to be adjusted so that the brakes, as we would call them for the rebound and compression, can slow down the speed of the tires moving in both directions adequately based on how much energy that it needs to dissipate. Now let's nerd out for a second here. Using hypothetical numbers, let's just assume for every inch of travel that your suspension uses up, that it's storing 10 pounds worth of energy. So if your suspension stays in that middle third, it never gets over 30 pounds of stored energy. So your valving is set to control that 30 pounds rather effectively, and the rate remains relatively the same. So your tire's kind of moving up and down at roughly the same rate. As you start to get further and further out into the stroke, there's more energy stored into it. If you're compressed in, say, 8 inches instead of 3 inches, then all of a sudden you're dealing with 80 pounds, and the valving in return isn't going to control that very well. So if we think about it, the faster you go or the harder you're hitting into things, and sand is a great example of this with all of the whoops, the more energy you're storing into this fork spring or the shock spring. Now, that wouldn't inherently be a problem if you were on a level surface. It would still be a little bit unstable, but when you're riding in sand whoops like this, your bike is constantly having one tire in the air or both tires in the air, and we've got all of that energy stored up already because I'm already using 2/3 of the stroke of the suspension just sitting on the bike before I've even plowed into anything. Those tires get fired out like a rocket. Now, the problem is they don't get fired at the same time, so you end up bouncing back and forth, and the bike becomes virtually uncontrollable. Not to mention that because you're already using up 2/3 of the suspension, you really only have about 3 inches of suspension travel to start with, but then you're unspringing it to its maximum length as you're going. So all of that being said, is this entire problem is rooted in that the initial setup of the bike by Honda was set for too light of a weight for heavy pushing like this. Get proper springs, get associated valving, please. For the love of all that is holy, do not put heavy springs in with this valving. The rebound problem will only get worse. I also wanted to thank everybody for indulging me. This turned into far more of a nerd out than I was intending. But summarized, Ktech good, stock less good. Here's a video of me going by in stock configuration. I look incredibly slow. I was incredibly slow, but watch as we go past here as I go around the corner. Man, that rear end was all over the place, and I wasn't even really pushing that hard because I was terrified. Pretty indicative of what it felt like to do this lap, though. It was terrible. Get good suspension if you're going to ride in sand. Otherwise, just enjoy the bike.